The air in the warehouse was thick, tasting of dust and old metal. Sarah could feel the rough rope digging into her wrists, tied behind her back to a cold support beam. A gag muffled her screams, but she wouldn't have screamed anyway. Not now. Her eyes, wide with a terror that clawed at her throat, were fixed on Mark, her fiancé. He stood under a single bare bulb, shadows stretching long and distorted around him, making him look less like the man she loved and more like a stranger. Across from him, a stern-faced man, Mr. Kim, held a sleek black briefcase. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and he didn't blink often. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that seemed out of place in the grimy warehouse. Mark, on the other hand, looked nervous, his usual confident smirk replaced by a twitching lip. He reached out, taking the briefcase from Mr. Kim. The sound of the latches clicking open was loud in the silence. Inside, neat stacks of crisp bills glowed under the dim light. Mark didn't even glance at the money at first. His eyes found Sarah's, a quick, dismissive look that made her stomach clench. "She's damaged goods," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. "But still valuable enough for this." He gestured vaguely in her direction, then turned his attention back to the briefcase, already counting his new fortune. A cold wave washed over Sarah. It wasn't just the words, but the way he said them, like he was talking about a broken toy, not a person he was supposed to marry. Her terror, sharp and suffocating moments before, mixed with a bitter resolve. Mark wasn't just abandoning her. He was selling her, and he thought she would just break. He thought she was done. But even as the ropes bit into her skin, even as the gag tasted like fear, something flickered inside Sarah. A spark. She subtly shifted her weight, testing the knots, feeling the slight give in the worn fibers. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was a start. A silent promise formed in her mind. She would not go down quietly. Not for him. Not for anyone. Mr. Kim, who had been watching Mark with an unnerving stillness, raised an eyebrow. He picked up on Mark's casual disregard, the way he spoke of Sarah, the lack of even a pretense of concern. A chilling, knowing look passed over Mr. Kim's face as he met Mark's gaze. It was a look that spoke of consequences, a quiet threat that Mark, absorbed in his briefcase, completely missed. It was a look that said, "Some debts are paid in blood, others in a fate far worse." As Mark began to shuffle the money, two burly men, silent and efficient, moved towards Sarah. They untied her, not gently, but not roughly either. One of them removed the gag. Sarah gasped, taking a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes still locked on Mark. He was still counting, still oblivious. They started to drag her away, towards a dark opening at the back of the warehouse. Sarah's head turned, twisting to keep Mark in sight. He was there, surrounded by his money, a small, pathetic figure consumed by his greed. He didn't even look up. The subtle shift in power dynamics, the unspoken warning from Mr. Kim, was completely lost on him. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Sarah grew up in a quiet suburban town in the United States, a place where everyone knew everyone else, and life moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. Her childhood was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and her mother's homemade apple pie. Her family wasn't rich, but they had enough. And more importantly, they had each other. Her father worked hard at the local factory, and her mother ran a small flower shop from their home. Sarah learned early on the value of honest work and simple pleasures. Her biggest dream, the one she nurtured since she was a little girl, was to open her own bakery. She imagined a cozy spot with warm lighting, the smell of cinnamon and sugar wafting onto the street, a place where people could gather for a good cup of coffee and a sweet treat. She loved the idea of making people happy through something she created with her own hands. Her days were a rhythm of early mornings, mixing dough, proofing bread, and experimenting with new frosting recipes. When she wasn't baking, she volunteered at the local community center, helping with after-school programs. She found joy in the small things, in helping others, and in the comfort of her familiar routine. One of Sarah's biggest strengths, but also her greatest weakness, was her trusting nature. She saw the best in everyone, sometimes even when the evidence pointed clearly in another direction. She had a deep-seated desire for a loving family, a home filled with laughter and warmth, just like the one she grew up in. This made her vulnerable, eager to believe in promises, and quick to forgive perceived flaws. She wanted to love and be loved fiercely, and this open heart often left her exposed. Then Mark came into her life. He was a real estate agent, ambitious and undeniably charming, with a smile that could light up a room. He swept her off her feet like a whirlwind, full of grand gestures and sweet words. He presented himself as her knight in shining armor, someone who understood her dreams and would help her achieve them. He seemed genuinely interested in her bakery plans, even offering advice on locations and marketing, making her feel seen and supported in a way no one else had. Mark smoothly wove himself into her life, becoming a fixture at family dinners, charming her parents with his polite manners and impressive stories. He remembered her grandmother's favorite tea and her father's preferred brand of beer. He made Sarah feel like the most special woman in the world, painting a picture of a future together that was almost too perfect. He was always there, always attentive, always saying the right thing. Their engagement, announced with a sparkling diamond ring and a joyous celebration, felt like the culmination of all her hopes. It was supposed to be a symbol of stability, happiness, and a lifelong partnership. But beneath the surface, the beautiful facade was slowly cracking. What Sarah didn't know, couldn't see through her trusting eyes, was that Mark's charm was a carefully constructed mask. His ambition was fueled by desperation, his support for her dreams a calculated move. He was sinking under mounting debts, entangled with dangerous individuals whose patience was wearing thin. Their engagement, her dreams, her very future, were all just pieces in his desperate game. He was setting the stage for his most desperate, most cruel act, one that would shatter her world and redefine everything she thought she knew about love and betrayal. As time went on, the perfect picture Mark painted started to fade, slowly revealing the cracks beneath. It wasn't a sudden break, but a gradual chipping away at Sarah's trust and happiness. Mark's promises became less reliable. He'd miss dates, forget anniversaries, and often failed to follow through on things he said he'd do. Each time, he'd have an elaborate excuse, a story about a last-minute business deal, or an emergency with a client. These were always followed by grand apologies, flowers, or some temporary gesture of affection that would soothe Sarah's hurt, but only for a little while. The pattern became familiar. Disappointment, an excuse, a brief reconciliation, and then the cycle would start again. He also started to subtly put her down. It wasn't always obvious, but it chipped away at her confidence. He'd make comments about her simple dreams of a bakery, comparing them to his grand business ventures. He'd say things like, "Don't you want more than just selling cupcakes, Sarah?" Or, "My deals are complex, not like your little kitchen experiments." He'd frame it as encouragement, pushing her to think bigger, but it always left her feeling inadequate, like her passion wasn't quite good enough compared to his world. She started to second-guess herself, wondering if her dreams were truly too small, too naive. Then there was the money. It was always about money with Mark. He'd constantly need funds for investments or temporary setbacks. He'd talk about a huge deal that was just about to close, but he needed a little cash to get it over the finish line. He'd promised to pay her back with interest, making it sound like she was a part of his success. Sarah, trusting and wanting to support the man she loved, drained her small savings, the money she had set aside for her bakery. She even borrowed from her family, explaining that Mark was on the cusp of something big and just needed a little help. Her family, seeing how happy Mark seemed to make her, reluctantly agreed, hoping it was true. Each time she handed over money, a tiny voice in her head whispered doubt, but she pushed it down, choosing to believe in him. There was one incident that really stuck with her. They were at a dinner with some of Mark's business associates. Sarah, excited about a new recipe she had perfected, started talking about her plans for the bakery. Mark cut her off mid-sentence, laughing and saying, "Oh, Sarah and her little baking projects. She thinks she's going to conquer the world with cookies." He then turned to his friends and launched into a long, detailed explanation of one of his own deals, completely ignoring her. Sarah felt her face flush, embarrassed and silenced. Later that night, she confronted him, hurt by his public belittling. He immediately spun it around, making her feel guilty. "You always do this, Sarah," he'd said. "You never trust me. You always make me look bad in front of my contacts. I'm trying to build a future for us, and you're worried about cupcakes." She ended up apologizing to him, feeling confused and like she had somehow failed him. Looking back, it was clear. Mark's betrayal that day in the warehouse, handing her over like property, wasn't a sudden, out-of-character act. It was the brutal culmination of years of emotional abuse and exploitation. He had systematically chipped away at her self-worth, drained her resources, and manipulated her trust and love for his own selfish gain. He hadn't just sold her. He had been selling pieces of her for a long, long time. The emotional atmosphere between Sarah and Mark became suffocating. What had once been small disagreements now turned into full-blown arguments, almost daily. Mark's financial pressures were clearly getting to him, and he took it out on Sarah. He'd snap at her for little things like leaving a light on or for asking about his day. Their discussions, which used to be calm and open, now became heated, always ending with Sarah feeling confused and, somehow, always blamed. He had a way of twisting her words, making her feel like she was the problem, that her concerns were just adding to his already heavy burden. She often found herself apologizing for things she didn't even understand, just to make the tension go away. The strain wasn't just inside their home, it started to spill out. Whispers began to circulate among their neighbors and even her own family. People noticed Mark's erratic behavior. He'd show up at local events looking overly stressed, then suddenly be seen driving a new, expensive car, only to complain about being broke the next week. His spending habits were a mystery and a source of quiet gossip. Sarah, meanwhile, became more withdrawn. She stopped attending community gatherings, her usual bright smile replaced by a worried, distant look. She felt the weight of their judgment, the unspoken questions in their eyes. She knew they saw her as naive, perhaps even foolish, for staying with Mark, for enduring his increasingly volatile moods. She started to avoid eye contact, feeling a deep shame that wasn't hers to carry. Mark's posture towards her worsened significantly. He became openly dismissive, no longer bothering with even the pretense of affection or interest. He spent less and less time at home, often coming back late, smelling of alcohol and a strange perfume that wasn't hers. When he was home, he was glued to his phone, taking calls in hushed tones, his voice low and secretive. If she asked who it was, he'd just glare at her, telling her to mind her own business. These secrets built a thick, impenetrable wall between them, isolating Sarah even further. She felt like she was living with a stranger, a man who had completely vanished behind a facade of debt and desperation. He stopped asking about her day, about her baking, about anything that mattered to her. Her dreams of the bakery, once a shared topic of conversation, were now met with a blank stare or an impatient sigh. It was as if she had become invisible to him, just another fixture in the house, a problem to be tolerated rather than a partner to be cherished. This period was Sarah's deepest emotional suffocation. She felt trapped, not just by Mark's behavior, but by her own lingering hope, her own inability to fully accept that the man she loved was gone, replaced by someone cold and calculating. Every day was a struggle to breathe, to find a reason to keep going. She was constantly on edge, waiting for the next outburst, the next dismissal, the next sign that he cared even less than he had the day before. The pressure mounted, a constant heavy weight on her chest, pushing her closer and closer to a breaking point she didn't even realize was coming. She felt the judgment from her community like a physical thing, seeing herself through their eyes as someone who couldn't escape, someone who was too blind or too weak to leave. It was a suffocating existence, a slow, painful erosion of her spirit, preparing her, in a cruel twist of fate, for the even harsher realities that lay just around the corner. She was lost in a fog of his making, unable to see a way out until one day, the fog lifted, or rather, was violently ripped away. The tension in the house was a suffocating blanket, but nothing could have prepared Sarah for the moment it was violently ripped away. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Mark was in the study, a room he usually kept locked, barking into his phone. Sarah, still half asleep, had gone to the kitchen for coffee when she heard his voice, sharper and more desperate than usual. She paused, a strange chill running down her spine. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, pulled her closer to the study door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for her to hear snippets of the conversation. "I need more time, Mr. Kim. Just a few more days, I swear," Mark pleaded, his voice cracking. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Mr. Kim. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. She pressed her ear closer to the door, her breath catching in her throat. Then came the words that shattered her world into a million pieces. "The girl. She's not a problem. She's part of the deal. The collateral, remember? You get her, and every penny is accounted for." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Collateral? The girl. A cold, sickening realization began to dawn on her. She instinctively knew he was talking about her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the horror she was hearing. Collateral for what? The gambling debts? The hushed phone calls? It all clicked into place with a horrifying precision. Mark's voice continued, a chilling display of his true nature. She's a little naive, but she'll do what she's told. And she's pretty enough for what you need. Think of it as a bonus, a little extra for your troubles, Mr. Kim." He even let out a short, cynical laugh. "Damaged goods, maybe, but still valuable enough for this." The phrase, "damaged goods," echoed in her head, twisting her stomach into knots. It wasn't just the words. It was the cold, calculating tone, devoid of any affection, any remorse, any sign that he was talking about the woman he was supposed to marry. He was discussing her as if she were an object, a piece of property to be traded away. A wave of shock so profound it made her dizzy washed over her. Disbelief warred with a crushing sense of betrayal. This wasn't the Mark she knew, or rather, the Mark she thought she knew. This was a monster, a man who had meticulously constructed a facade of love and commitment, only to reveal a soul utterly devoid of humanity. The profound betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could. It wasn't just that he was selling her. It was that he had planned it, orchestrated it, all while pretending to love her. For a moment, Sarah thought she might collapse. Her legs felt like jelly, her vision blurred. But then, something shifted inside her. The initial shock gave way to a surge of defiant, incandescent anger. It wasn't a wild, uncontrollable rage, but a cold, steady burn that settled deep in her core. She wouldn't confront him, not yet. That would be foolish, dangerous. He was desperate, cornered, and capable of anything. In that instant, a decision solidified in her mind. She would play along. She would let him think he had won, let him believe she was still the naive, trusting woman he had so easily manipulated. But beneath that facade, she would be meticulously planning her escape, planning her survival, and planning her revenge. This moment, overhearing those terrible words, was the turning point. It shattered the illusion of her life with Mark completely, but it also broke the cycle of suffering she had been trapped in. It transformed her from a passive victim, silently enduring his emotional abuse, into an active agent, determined to reclaim her life. The naive girl who had dreamed of a bakery was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the true meaning of betrayal and was ready to fight for her freedom. Her understanding of reality was completely rewritten, and she was now on a new, dangerous path, but one she would walk with a newfound, steely resolve. The world blurred around Sarah as she was roughly pulled away. Mark, already counting the money, didn't even glance up. The cold warehouse air bit at her skin, but it was the icy grip of fear that truly paralyzed her. She was now completely in Mr. Kim's hands, a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen to play. The initial moments were a jumble of raw terror and a strange, almost detached sense of clarity. The fear was real, a primal instinct screaming for escape, but the clarity came from knowing, finally, the true depths of Mark's betrayal. There was no more illusion, no more hope for what they once were. Only the stark reality of her situation remained. Her first few days under Mr. Kim's control were a blur of overwhelming anxiety. She was taken to a large, surprisingly clean building, not a dungeon or a dirty back room, but a place that felt more like a highly secured, if austere, residence. Her movements were restricted, but she wasn't chained. She was simply watched, always. The men who guarded her were quiet, professional, and gave off an air of disciplined efficiency. They didn't speak to her much, and when they did, it was in short, direct commands, always respectful in tone, if not in context. This was not the rough, chaotic environment she had imagined. It was unnerving in its order. Mr. Kim himself was a puzzle. He rarely spoke to her directly in those early days, observing her from a distance. He was a man of few words, his expressions unreadable, yet there was a certain weight to his presence, a quiet authority that commanded respect from his men. He was intimidating, yes, but not in the way Mark had been. Mark's intimidation was born of desperation and manipulative charm. Mr. Kim's came from a deep-seated power and a sense of absolute control. Sarah noticed subtle things. The way his men bowed slightly when he entered a room, the careful attention to detail in their operations, the almost ritualistic way they conducted their business. It was all very different from the sloppy, desperate chaos Mark had lived in. This was an organized machine, a world with its own rules and a strict code of conduct. It was a stark contrast to Mark's world, which had been built on lies and broken promises. The cultural dynamics of this Korean-American underworld were slowly revealing themselves, and they were far more complex than she could have imagined. There was an emphasis on honor, on respect, even in this dark corner of society. It made her wonder if Mark, in his desperation, had truly understood who he was dealing with. Her psychological state was a tangled mess. The trauma of Mark's betrayal was a constant ache, a wound that refused to heal. But alongside it, a strange resilience began to bloom. She was forced to adapt, to observe, to understand her new surroundings. She watched the men, learned their routines, listened to the snippets of conversation she could catch. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and her mind, once clouded by heartbreak, was now sharp, focused on her next move. She found herself inadvertently gaining a strange kind of respect from her captors. Her quiet strength, her refusal to break down or beg, seemed to resonate with them. They saw her as something more than just damaged goods, something Mark could never have understood. She was still afraid, but that fear was now tempered by a steely determination. She would not only survive this, but she would also find a way to make Mark pay. This new path was terrifying, but it was also empowering. The naive girl was gone, replaced by a woman forged in betrayal, ready to face whatever came next. Sarah's quiet strength didn't go unnoticed. She started helping out where she could, first with small tasks, organizing things, then slowly, with more important matters. She had a knack for numbers and organization, skills honed from years of managing her bakery dream on paper. Mr. Kim, initially just observing, began to involve her in small aspects of his legitimate businesses, the ones that served as fronts for his more shadowy operations. He saw her not as a captive, but as a resource, someone with a clear head and a surprising ability to adapt. She earned his respect, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, quiet competence. He started to treat her differently, not with warmth, but with a certain deference, a recognition of her intelligence and resilience. He became an unexpected protector, ensuring her comfort and safety, a stark contrast to Mark's callous betrayal. The final reckoning for Mark was something Mr. Kim handled with surgical precision. He had his own code of honor, and Mark's disrespect, his casual disregard for a human life, had offended it deeply. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. Mr. Kim began by subtly cutting off Mark's access to the shady networks he relied on. Deals fell through, contacts vanished, and suddenly, Mark's house of cards began to crumble. His gambling debts, once manageable with illicit loans, became insurmountable. The very people he thought he had outsmarted turned on him. There were whispers of other, even more ruthless individuals Mark had double-crossed, now coming to collect. Sarah heard snippets of Mark's downfall from Mr. Kim's men. His lavish lifestyle evaporated. His real estate business, built on shaky foundations, collapsed. He lost his house, his fancy cars, everything he had used to project an image of success. The last Sarah heard, he was facing serious charges, not just for his debts, but for various frauds he'd committed over the years. His freedom was gone, his reputation in tatters. The poetic justice was undeniable. Mark, who had sold her for a briefcase of money, ended up with nothing. His own life a wreck of his own making. With Mr. Kim's discreet assistance, Sarah began to rebuild her life. He arranged for her to have new documents, a clean slate. He didn't offer her money directly, but he opened doors, providing her with the means and the opportunity to start fresh. She found a small space in a quiet neighborhood, far from her old life. It wasn't fancy, but it had good light and a welcoming feel. She poured all her energy and the quiet determination she had forged in the darkest times into it. The sign above the door read, "Sarah's Sweet Escapes." It was her bakery, finally. The smell of fresh bread and pastries filled the air, a comforting aroma that spoke of new beginnings. Her dreams, once almost crushed, were now a reality. She had a steady stream of customers, people who appreciated her baking and her quiet, friendly demeanor. They didn't know her story, and that was fine by her. Sometimes, a black car would pull up outside, and one of Mr. Kim's men would come in, buy a coffee, and leave a small unmarked envelope. It was never money, but usually a newspaper clipping, a subtle update on the fate of those who had wronged her, or a note acknowledging her progress. It was Mr. Kim's way of watching over her, a silent reminder of the complex relationship they shared. Sarah had found a sense of peace, an independence she never thought possible. The journey had been terrifying, filled with betrayal and uncertainty, but it had also forged her into someone stronger, wiser. She had learned that gentleness could come from the most unexpected places, from individuals who operated outside the lines, but still possessed their own strange code of honor. She was held gently now, not by a lover, but by the quiet strength within herself, and the unlikely protection of a man whose world was far different from her own. She was free, baking her dreams into reality, a testament to resilience and a quiet triumph over the darkness.